welcome to the Theology Pugcast. Great to have you here for this Yuletide episode of the Pugcast. And we're glad to be together. A couple of guys on the show are dressed up in their Christmas best. And I guess maybe if you consider green okay for Christmas too, I'm good, but I'm not wearing red. Anyway, I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor, and I serve a church right outside Portland, Oregon, and I write books. Anyway, enough about me. How about you, Tom?
I'm Tom Price. I teach theology, Christian ethics at Gordon Conwell Seminary, and I also serve a church in Plainville, Connecticut.
And you write books too?
Yeah.
You just don't publish them.
I know. I'm a picky guy. I have to fight myself on that, but I have a lot in the works.
Anyway, well, whenever you get it done, Tom, we'll be sure to review it in Touchstone Magazine, where I'm a senior editor.
Perfect.
All right, Glenn, why don't you take it away? It's your show. First, with introduce yourself, of course, and then let us know what we're talking about.
Yeah, I am Glenn Sunshine. By contract, I'm obligated to say I'm a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I'm also a retired history professor specializing in Renaissance and Reformation Europe and a lot of medieval too. And I'm writing a lot of different things, a lot on Substack. I'm working on 2 different books now. One of them with Ken Boa and another author whose name escapes me because I've never met him. On
good old what's his face?
Jim. Okay. On the gospel as romance. It's looking at the gospel through the lens of, when you look at romance stories, they all follow the same pattern, the same basic pattern, and that pattern actually reflects the gospel in some really interesting ways. So we're working on that. It's as part of a couple of books that we're working on the uniqueness of Christianity. And then along with that, I'm working on a book on reenchantment. I'm in the process of doing videos that will form the basis for chapters in the books, and I'm just about at the end of the Dark Enchantment series. And I'll be very happy after the first of the year to start looking at what Christian reenchantment looks like.
Yeah.
So
I
those are a
it's
couple of things
depressing
that
to
I'm
get
doing.
into. It's depressing to spend all that time on the Dark Enchantment stuff.
Months.
Yeah.
But actually, both of those are relevant for our topic of the day today. This is actually, I hope, going to head toward a seasonal topic, but I'm going back to C.S. Lewis and Lewis's recognition. A key thing that leads to his conversion is the idea of the gospel as a true myth, as myth made fact. The key conversation on Addison's walk with Tolkien and Dyson really showed him this. And again, the context there is that Lewis really was moved, really loved all of the myths of dying and rising gods, especially Balder, but some of the others as well. But when he encountered it in Christianity, it left him cold. And probably, I'm not sure I'm going to speculate on the reason there, but what Tolkien and Dyson pointed out to him is that the gospel is really just like one of these myths that he loved so much. And it was curious that it left him cold, but especially the difference was that it really happened. It really happened. It's myth made fact.
It's interesting there because I was just reading over this material recently, and it's where he lumps the gospel at this time, because for him, he was living in the world that bifurcated cold reason and detachment from the warmth of these kind of myths and stories that you could really connect with, and meaning and value was everywhere. But he just didn't believe they were part of that world that was the real world, which was really grim and dry and boring. Mm. So I think by thinking that Christianity had this kind of strong historical emphasis, and history was not really read in this deeper kind of almost romantic way of connectedness to everything, but detached, he was reading it through that the kind of divided world he was living in. So for him, the rationality brought you to the grim fact of reality. And this other world was imaginary, and yet it's warm and where all the meaning was. And so it was in this connection where myth made fact was a way of bridging reason and what appeared to be just kind of fantasy that you could connect with, to basically being a larger category for reality and describing it. So myth takes on a very comprehensive sense with the conversation you're talking about for him.
Yeah. So where this goes for Lewis is he recognizes in all of these myths elements that reflect the gospel. He describes them as being the good dreams of the pagans. Tolkien called it splintered light. The idea that there is truth out there, that God has the truths of God are evident to the people in the world. And they may not get it completely, but at least the poets, the people who are sensitive, pick up elements of truth, even if they don't understand them completely or get their full significance. And so there are these elements that end up reflecting the gospel in all of these different cultures.
Yeah,
in the mythologies.
I think many people are open to the idea of condemnation being evident in the workings of God's Spirit in our hearts. And in other words, the idea that the law is written on the heart. But what this does is this takes us into a much bigger sort of world where not only is the law evident, but even the gospel is in some sense hinted at in lots of ways in different places. There are all kinds of things that we could point to in terms of what missionaries have told us about their experiences, proclaiming the gospel in places and people in those places being able to make connections to their own mythologies, stuff like that.
Right. Yeah. Traces would be the word Augustine would use. There are traces early on in all these other cultures, not just Judaism. Judaism has a special place, of course. It's the body that brings forth the incarnation. But these other ones have echoes that will point to Christ being that fulfillment of them. And these myths, too, have echoes from these different places and cultures that point to Christ being the fulfillment of them.
Yeah, and the interesting part of this is that on a missiological level, if you are particularly a foreign missionary, but even if it's someone from a related culture, the gospel doesn't get a lot of purchase unless it can connect in with something the people already know or believe. If you just come in and present something that is completely foreign to everything they think and they know, it's, on a human level at least, it's not going to go anywhere. The Holy Spirit can do what the Holy Spirit wants to do. I'm not setting limits on him. But in terms of effectively communicating the gospel, you've got to find the connection points within the culture. The classic book on this is Don Richardson's Peace Child.
Yeah.
Contextualizing the gospel, putting the gospel in terms that the people can understand is critical. We did a show a while ago on the Vikings, the conversion of the Vikings. And one of the things that I talked about there is the way the myth of Ragnarok, and particularly Yggdrasil, the world tree, was used as a picture of the gospel. And this actually continued well into the Christian era. I mean, you can look at the iconography in the stave churches, for example, and things like that, and you see images from Ragnarok on it. So we have that. There's a way in which all of these cultures have, splintered light. I like Tolkien's phrase there, or the good dreams of the pagans, where they are somehow picking up something of the truth that would become most clear and most evident and complete in Christ, not as only a myth. Lewis is insistent that the gospel is a myth, but it is also history and also fact. Okay, so that was my jumping off point as I was thinking about this episode. What I'm struck by is it also works the other way around. In other words, you can look at the gospel and then ask yourself the question, what are the mythic elements in this? What are the elements that we see in here that radiate out into other cultures? As the truth, as the actual history is revealed, how is this mythic? How does it connect into, well, other cultural traditions, but also the idea of myth itself? I suppose I should pause here and talk about Lewis's definition of myth. Lewis says myth is the thing that connects our understanding of the world, which is always finite and limited and never completely adequate, with reality. Myth is the bridge between our rationality and ultimate reality. So
let's explore that a little bit.
In that zone.
Let's explore that a little bit, Glenn, because when we think of myths, we think of stories. Mm-hmm. And stories, of course, have a way of captivating us and kind of drawing us in. And I think the reasons have to do with the fact that, we ourselves are kind of living in a story, and our lives, and when we think about our own lives, we think about them as kind of storied. But I'm wondering, is there more to it than that when you're talking about myth, or is there something more? Is there something maybe abstract as well that's going on, or maybe even mystical, understood in the best way?
Well, I think that story and myth here are more comprehensive categories than, say, pure reason, or just kind of if you could have something like pure history. Because what it does, it allows for those dimensions of reality that just aren't historical and just aren't rational to be included. Meaning that, they're all interconnected. But I think myth is a much more comprehensive category. So rather than, I think, again, the way of reading it, the way a modernist would, that myth has to do with just the imaginative and the subjective, right? The way in which we overlay the world with our own dreamy fantasies or kind of poetic ornamentation. But he's arguing it's the other way around. It's actually that these are ways in which we capture fuller dimensions of what is real about reality, God, the world, ourselves, and they can't be reduced to the purely rational or just the purely historical. Rather, those are part of this larger comprehensive way of seeing things. So the story, the narrative, the myth is the larger comprehensive category.
Yeah. Now, remember, for Lewis is a rationalist. And so for him, what you understand, what he originally understood as being truth, that is something that's you get to through reason, through empiricism, through all the roots that a mid-20th century rationalist would accept. Myth doesn't operate in that zone. Myth operates only through story. Lewis says that as soon as you put an interpretation on a myth, you reduce it to allegory, and then it no longer functions as myth. The thing about myth as story is that it has the potential to connect with a lot of different things. There are a lot of conclusions, there are a lot of lessons, there are a lot of things that you can get out of it. But the only way that happens is if you encounter the myth, as a story, not if you try to explain it and put out a rational case about what this really means.
Right. Now, that doesn't mean that myths or stories are irrational.
No.
Meaning that what we're talking about is maybe a way that people, maybe only rationalists, when they're using reason, can be said to be practicing. In other words, if you think about, say, people who are imaginative and really kind of have an artistic disposition, often those people are a real source of frustration to the rationalists. I've known people who have a rationalist outlook, and they're really one-dimensional people. I hate to say it that way, but they lack kind of an imaginative life. They really don't think in terms of meaning at all. They think in terms of, I don't know, I don't even think it's fair to say they think mathematically, because I think math is much more mystical
Yeah.
than
It
I think
is.
Pythagoras was onto some things.
Yeah. That's
Well,
right.
okay, think about it like this. When we look at a parable, okay, we are used to the idea that the parable has meaning, that it means something that is not conveyed by the story by itself. So the sower and the seed isn't about a guy sowing seed. That's not what it's about. That's the plot of the parable, but the plot doesn't tell you what the parable is really about. Now, Jesus gave us an interpretation of that. But when you look at the other parables, it turns out that if you read different sermons on those parables or read different commentaries on those parables, you're going to see people seeing all kinds of different things in those parables,
Right.
because the parable conveys with it more than just a simple meaning. It is mythic.
Yeah.
You know, it has that kind of multivalent quality. And unless you encounter it as a story and look at it that way, you're not going to, or, well, they're not all stories, they're not all narratives, but unless you look at it that way, you're not going to be able to see its relevance to you. You're not going to be able to draw the right conclusions for yourself.
I saw a really good treatment of this with the parable of the prodigal son, where there was someone who studied sermons from different time periods and how differently people approached it and what they got out of it. It's the same story. I mean, it's the same parable, but the interpretations actually told you a lot about the period of time that people lived in, and how they thought about even things like sin and compassion and the fatherhood of God and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So, and the reason is that the story itself, encountered as story, opens up the possibility of all these other dimensions.
Now, this is something that makes the rationalists very uncomfortable, because they like truth in the same way that, say, a person who collects bugs likes bugs. They put them in a pin, and they put a pin through them and stick them on a category and collect them, and then take them out every once in a while and look at them. But they're dead. You've got a bunch of dead bugs in a drawer, and they want to nail it down in that way.
Yeah. And unfortunately, reality doesn't nail down that well. And that's what Lewis is getting at. We don't, as finite beings, we don't really have direct access in rational terms to fundamental reality. And again, the function of myth is to fit in that place, to bridge the gap between what we can know through reason, understood broadly, and what real reality is. Now, Lewis is quick to say that not all myths are good. You've got good myths, you've got bad myths. Some of them take you to very bad places.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, myth is necessary for us in order to connect into these deeper realms of reality.
And it as a descriptive category, it's a way of including all the elements into a fuller kind of realism. It's not a move away from the real, it's a move towards it. And I think this is what's hard. A lot of people think, because the rational and the real are connected, therefore the rational alone is the only aspect of the real. But as we see, if we just limit ourselves to rationalism in a very narrow way, we've put out of the picture so much more of what reality has in it that reason is a core part of, but is not comprehensive enough a category to get a hold of. It's interesting because in philosophy, you have first the schools that, the myths. And it is from the myths that you start to get the philosophical reflection on those stories where you get the emphasis on logos. So there's always this debate between mythos or logos as the primary category for accessing full reality. And I just had been reminded of a book of a debate between two Catholic theologians. One is arguing for the primacy of mythos. The other is logos. Of course, they end in a very mutual reinforcing and I think a robust theology after the conversation. But it is fascinating that this debate still goes on from that angle. But it's kind of what Lewis's and the Inklings were up to.
Right. Yeah. So myth made fact is mythos meets logos. I mean,
that's right. Logos embedded in the deeper category of mythos. Yeah.
Yeah. On some level, it reminds me of Vervaeke's stuff about left and right brain. The left brain is sort of focused and looks at individual items and analyzes those. The right brain has a more universal outlook, more holistic outlook. And Vervaeke's argument is Western society has become overwhelmingly left brain, when in reality a proper balanced approach would be both hemispheres working, and preferably with the left sort of subservient to the right, so that the holistic outlook determines what you do with your focused analytical stuff.
Yeah.
And that to me is logos and mythos in a very real sense, what you're looking at there.
And this is very different than, say, what the liberal theologians like a John Hick were trying to do when they said the incarnation as myth. They did not mean what Lewis meant by myth. And so that's kind of probably where you're going with the gospel's impact on it. So I don't want to run there.
and I think many contemporary Christians who are not liberal like Hick was think in those terms too. Hick was expressing sort of the modern way of thinking and trying to figure out a way to understand myth. And of course, he naturally went into the subjective. So it's just like, it's got this kind of personal, sort of unreal take on things. And you're kind of, everything's eisegesis. You're reading meaning into things that are meaningless in character.
Right. The realm of value detached from the realm of fact.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And a lot of people, when they, I can think about my early phase of, sort of my intellectual journey. All I wanted was Paul, and I only wanted like Romans and Galatians,
Romans
and
11.
And I didn't have any patience even for like Hebrews. It was like I was almost a Marcionite in the sense that, I was impatient with the Gospels. I just wanted abstraction. That's all I wanted. Because I thought that was mature. I thought that was where it was at.
Yeah.
And right now for me, I'm kind of becoming increasingly old school here. I'm focusing on the Gospels and the Psalms.
Yeah.
Which is
I was completely impatient
kind of
with
the
the
opposite
Psalms.
Direction of where I used to be.
For me, the Psalms were like a bunch of like. It's sort of like romantic literature, like by Harlequin romances. But just basically the idea, it's all syrupy, it's all your emotions, it's all this kind of stuff. I feel like I'm being persecuted today, so like the world's against me, so I'll read about that. I'm kind of feeling down, so I'll read something that'll pick me up. That's kind of the way I thought about the Psalms. I didn't think about them as prayers, and I didn't really have a very, I think, even though I loved drawing and painting and all that kind of stuff, I had a very, very, I think, superficial and immature understanding of even what art was about.
Yeah. Well, and we run into that problem. I strongly suspect that there are going to be some people who are going to raise eyebrows when we talk about the gospel as myth.
Yeah. Right.
Because our current usage of the word myth is something that's false.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's just a myth.
Right.
It's something that isn't real. Or we just view them as essentially made up stories. That sort of thing. And yet
we might get a bunch of we might get a bunch of like new atheists tuning into the show, thinking that we're going to be giving them some like material to work with.
That was entertaining.
That's right.
Get used to disappointment. But when you look at, I've talked about Lewis's definition of myth. There are others out there as well where myths are the foundational stories of a culture. They're what the culture tells about, what the culture says about itself, what it believes about itself, what it believes where it came from, all of those kinds of things. In a very real way, I've talked about the secular myth of origins. where you can come up, once you've got the Big Bang, you can come up with a purely naturalistic explanation, in quotation marks, of what happened since then. And that's effectively a secular myth. It's the story we tell ourselves about reality.
Just as a kind of excursus here, let me just mention that I've grown less and less patient with people who take the current state of sort of like the conventional wisdom in the sciences and try to harmonize it with Christianity, because we keep discovering that these theories that kind of have a commanding view of the moment get undermined. And so there's all this investment that people make in terms of, just think about the Big Bang and some of the things that have come out with recent discoveries from the James Webb Telescope. I mean, all that stuff that people believed was settled is all up in the air again. And
well, that's also the thing you can launch back to the secularists, where we keep redating the universe.
Right.
I mean, if they're how reliable is your stuff when you have to change it every 6 weeks, and come up with a new figure?
So for me, I just stick to the confessions and say, there's a lot of stuff out there we just don't know about, and let's not pretend that we know more than we do. And when it comes to the empirical sciences, I'm glad for electricity and I'm glad for air conditioning and antibiotics, but we don't know as much as we tend to about the physical world, just the physical world, as we think we do.
Yeah, I mean, when you get down to it, physics, the physicists will talk about forces, but they don't really know what they are. They'll talk about energy, but they don't really have a definition of that. They'll talk about particles, but they don't really. They've got mathematical descriptions of them, but they don't really know what they are. I mean, when you get down to it, there are a whole lot of things that we talk about in physics that the physicists say, yeah, we know this is how it works, but we don't really know what it is. It's sort of like rather the opposite with AI. We know what it is, but we don't know how it does what it does.
Right. Yeah. But you just
those models almost.
Yeah, just
they function with almost mythic elements,
Well, getting to that, just about mathematics, they don't know why it works.
Yeah.
They're basically just two schools of thought. Either you're a Platonist, or you think that it's just sort of a social convention, just like everything else. And can you really do math if you think it's just a social convention? I mean, it's just nuts that people.
It makes it a whole lot easier to get answers.
Well, it also makes it a whole lot easier for people to justify why, doing poorly in math can be explained, because after all, I'm oppressed.
Like you said, it makes it a lot easier to get answers. I mean, unfortunately, those answers won't make the bridge hold up.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
But one of the things, Lewis would be the first one to run on this, is one of the things about these socially constructed myths that are kind of reducing social construction to kind of subjectivity, or just the internalization of a society of a set of power structures, is the fact that they can't all have the same comprehensive way of making intelligible all those aspects of reality that we need to, which mathematics does. And so not all stories, myths, constructs are of the same quality. That's the nature of what they're dealing with here. And I think the bad way of interpreting myth is that they're all just fantastic social constructs, or the projection of our meaning and value onto the world, where it's working the other way around for Lewis.
Right. Yeah. So again, splintered light or good dreams of the pagans. They're actually getting glimpses of truth. Yeah. Garbled, misunderstood, but nonetheless, they're catching a glimpse of something here that is part of the fundamental reality. There's that word again, fundamental reality of the world that God has created. And that's not just the physical universe. We have to realize the world is bigger than the physical universe. The reality that God created is the entire story of redemption. That's part of it. And so in the myths, with the dying and rising gods in particular, Lewis saw that as a way in which the pagan world had glimpses of the truth most perfectly expressed in Christianity and fully expressed in Jesus Christ. Now, the thing that I've been playing with recently is looking at this the other way around. We can look at myth and say, okay, how does this reflect the gospel? We can turn it around and say, let's look at the gospel and see how it is reflected in myth. So start with the gospel and then say, all right, what connections do we see here with other things? Now, the dying and rising God one is the one Lewis focused on. I decided to try a little bit of an exercise doing this with the Gospel of Matthew. Looking at Matthew, particularly 1 and 2, it gets a little more difficult after that. But the story surrounding the Nativity and the visit of the Magi. And it turns out that if you look at this and say, all right, what elements from this do we see in world mythology? It turns out there's a surprising number of them. Now, there are some obvious things like angelic visitations. In all of the myths, there are supernatural beings that come down and speak to people. Tell them what to do or give them help, aid, and assistance or whatever. Okay, so that one is easy. But there are other things when you start digging into it that I thought were really interesting. So, Mary's found to be pregnant. Oh, mysterious birth. All you need to do is read Joseph Campbell and you'll get that one. Okay. So Mary's pregnant. Joseph, being a just man, decides to divorce her quietly. He doesn't want to embarrass her. He doesn't want to shame her. He is a good man. However, what happens? An angel comes to him. Okay, angelic visitation, supernatural. What does the angel say to him? What are the first words that the angel says? Joseph, son of David, stop. Have no fear is always, anytime an angel appears, you get have no fear. Fear not. Okay.
Right.
But Joseph, son of David, pause here for a moment. Joseph is a technon. He's a craftsman, actually kind of a skilled builder. Okay. He's not a carpenter because nobody built houses of wood there. He was more likely to be something more like a mason or something along those lines. But in any event, he's a carpenter. He's a poor worker. I mean, we know he's poor because in the Gospel of Luke, they give when Mary's days of purification are done, they give the offering that's for poor people. So we know he's poor. But son of David is really important in Scripture because the son of David is, well, of course, the Messiah. And in Joseph's case, he is not the Messiah, capital M, but it is also the title of the heirs of David.
Right.
The son of David is the one who inherits David's throne. Okay, so the angel is acknowledging Joseph functionally as the legitimate king of Israel, just with the title son of David. And yet he's a poor peasant. So what we see here is a theme that shows up across cultures about a king who is hidden, who is not actually on the throne, but he's the legitimate heir to the throne. And usually in these stories, something happens where he ends up getting the throne back. In Joseph's case, that isn't it. But this idea of the hidden king, and this king who is living in obscurity and all of that kind of thing, but who is the one who is the heir. I think we overlook that son of David pretty readily.
Yeah, well, there are stories, obviously, in the Western tradition, like the Arthurian legends, and the Sword and the Stone, and we can think, of course, of the Lord of the Rings, but this whole idea that somehow there's some way to discern his worth, to discern his noble lineage, and in the Sword and the Stone, it's the ability to remove the stone or the sword from the stone. I think maybe there's also a kind of delight in a rags to riches kind of story. You see, you see that even in something like Harry Potter, where you get this kid who is being raised by these really Philistines who are, uh, unaware of his specialness. In fact, if there's any hint of his specialness, they resent it. But I think that's one of the reasons why, say, the Harry Potter stories have a mythic character as well, because it's kind of tying into this much larger, richer kind of background of myth. We've complained a lot about what happened to the Star Wars epics, and it's because they departed from the mythic and got into the politically correct, and that's one of the best ways to ruin anything.
Yeah. So, like I said, the Son of David thing, my pastor a while ago preached through the Psalms. And it's worth noting that every psalm that is listed as being of David, almost invariably, it also, you can read it as being about Christ.
Mm.
So the title, with that in mind, and coming at it with this idea of, all right, what mythic dimensions are there here? The Son of David thing really jumped out at me this time through. And it's something I've never seen before. Like I said, the hidden king, rags to riches. Arthur is the great example. Of course, it's post-Christian.
Right.
It's after Christianity comes. It emerges in a Christian context. And at that point, we can say that Arthur is functioning on some level as a reflection of this story.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, and of course, when we think about the story of the Lord, he was hidden in the sense that if they had known who he was, they would not have crucified him. That's something that Paul notes in Corinthians.
Well, there's also the meme that I post every now and then that says that Herod is the one person in the Christmas story who actually understood what happened.
That's right. I'm going to be preaching on him in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, right. He's the one guy who actually understood the implications of what was going on here.
Right.
And actually, that kind of brings us to a second set of themes we can move into chapter 2 and look at what's going on there. Signs in the heavens.
Right.
A good element of loads of different kinds of myths. Right. But along with that, you get Herod, the evil king.
Right.
In the context of Joseph as the son of David, the usurping king. Again, constant theme that you run into in myths and legends around the world.
So thinking about the heavens, what comes to my mind quickly is the Aeneid, when you have Ilius, and the question is, whether or not, Aeneas and his family should flee from Troy, and Chryses, the father, says, "No, I'm not leaving." But then there's a sign in the heavens that indicates that Ilius is to be a king. They see a comet or a meteor or something flash across the sky, and that's followed by another sign. But there's that element as well in a story that was written roughly contemporaneously with the life of Christ.
Yeah, well, and people from time out of mind, you can go all the way back to the Babylonians.
Mm-hmm.
People from time out of mind always looked to the heavens for signs.
Right.
That would either instruct them or warn them.
Well, and we have the Magi from the east, who are obviously guys coming from Persia or Babylon, who are making an entrance to help people understand what's going on.
Right. Yeah, but they're functionally stargazers.
Right.
So so again, this idea of the star. Now, we have to be careful here. I am not saying that this is just a made-up story. I'm not going Jesus Smith route here. This is stuff that really happened. But you can see the resonances of this story in all of these other myths. It's not like this story came from those myths. It's really those myths, even though they predate it, come from this story. because this is the kernel. This is the center of history. Everything radiates from this in both directions.
Well, and also, in terms of the divine decrees, this has all been decreed. So you can say that this is history before history, in the sense that this is a playing out of something that was already written, in the sense of the will of God.
Yeah.
And
theologians will often
spilling over into other cultures.
Yeah, and theologians will often talk about prolepsis. It's just a word similar for history fulfilled working backwards, or eschatology, which is the end, which is eternally also the beginning, right? And it filling all things. This is how sacramental view of history can work, where Abraham can be participating in Christ, even though these things haven't happened. And but what's interesting with this is that, and this is something I think Lewis was big on, is on one hand, he understood conversion to be a moving into this true myth, right? It's a moving from the shadow to the real deal, the genuine article. And yet, because this genuine article is a bridging of heaven and earth in the Christian understanding, and this is where it gets a little naughty.
That's naughty with a K, not naughty.
That's right. That's right. And N-O-T. Yeah. I guess you can put it both ways. Because even when we're talking about, redemptive history or salvation history, what really happened historically in relationship to God's actions in relationship to humanity in creating and redeeming, that historical dimension is mythic all the way through. Because why? The temporal is not able to contain the eternal. It goes the other way around. And so the temporal always is going to be something that doesn't have the capacity to be literal in reference to the eternal. So it's always going to be something reaching out for comprehending it. And that's a fascinating thing. But one of the things Lewis talks about is what he calls conversion. When we're converted away from, into the true myth, as you will, into the real way of seeing things in Christ, there is also a transformation of where all of our language ideas and all of these former things used to reference, and now they are moved towards referencing to him in eternal things. So there is actually a way in which these myths, like you said, can be shown to be pointing here, but can be shown to be fulfilled here. And now they take on a different meaning themselves. And this is why Christians will begin writing these author legends and these other things, because they are now seen almost from the side of their fulfillment rather than what they were pointing to in a weak or lesser sense prior to the conversion of them.
Right. I've heard the same thing noted with regard to fairy tales and how in the West they end happily ever after, which would not have been a way to end them before the gospel had been proclaimed. When you think about like Ragnarok, it ends very sadly. Right? So,
although in their original form, not all the fairy tales ended happily ever after.
That's what I'm getting at. That there was a Christianization of the fairy tales, just like you could say there was a Christianization of, say, Beowulf. If our understanding of Beowulf is that it is older than, say, the coming of Christianity to Europe, then there's been a Christianization or a reinterpretation of the story as we now have it.
Yeah, the poem that we have now certainly includes Christian commentary on a pagan past.
Right.
Now there's another dimension of this too, though, that I want to look at. I want to think about Herod for a moment. So Herod is the I would say the archetype of the false king, the usurping king, who is out to destroy the true king. Okay, so we've got this.
It's only because he was misunderstood, Glenn. We all know that now. We've got great works of literature like Wicked to tell us that the Wicked Witch of the West was just misunderstood.
And we've got Greta Gerwig too. Yeah. Now, I want you to think about Herod. Well, okay, Jesus is depicted in Matthew as the true Israel. okay, as the one who fulfills everything Israel ought to be. He's depicted in Paul as the new Adam. Think about where Herod fits into those stories. We see in the garden an attempt by Satan to destroy humanity. Okay. And, there are early Christian writers who suggest the reason for that was Satan was jealous because God put humanity in charge of the world rather than him. Okay, we don't know what the reason was, but he's trying to destroy humanity there. He's not just trying to produce the fall, he's trying to kill them because God has said, on the day you eat it, you shall die. And he lies to Eve, oh no, that's not going to happen. But he expects God to carry out what he said because God is a God of justice and he keeps his word. So he's trying to destroy humanity right there. Then you see with Israel, Pharaoh playing the same role, trying to destroy Israel by throwing all the babies into the Nile, all the boys. Then you see Satan trying to destroy Israel again by leading them into idolatry, and the nation itself dies when it goes into exile. And now Satan is trying to do it through Herod directly to Jesus. There's a pattern here that is, that we see over and over again. And if you go to the book of Revelation, what do you see in the book of Revelation? The beast is trying to destroy the church, trying to destroy the bride. This becomes explicit starting in chapter 12. Okay, so this is the pattern of history that is being recapitulated. I'm not sure that's the right word. That is being encapsulated in Herod and Christ. And I would argue that Herod and Christ is the prototype. This is the archetype, and all of these others are kind of emanations from this. Kind of an odd way of looking at it because we're so used to thinking chronologically. I'm a historian. I pay a lot of attention to chronology.
Yeah.
But I think the whole prolepsis idea that this event radiates in both directions, forward and backwards in time, I think that's important here.
Yeah. I'm tracking with you. As I'm thinking about it, there are so many things that kind of flood my mind with regard to how this is all coming about, and then playing it forward even to our time. So it's not as though this ends. In other words, there are no things in our time that don't have a mythic quality. It seems to me that if we're thinking about this consistently, and if we take prolepsis to heart, then we could look around and see things in our own time that seem to remind us of these mythic elements.
Yeah, and the reason is because these are things that are baked into reality as a result of creation and the fall. That God has established these as fundamental truths of humanity in the face of sin, but also in the face of redemption, both sides.
Another dimension to this, I've been doing some work recently in Orlando Patterson, his books, Social Death, and then Freedom in the Making of Western Culture. He uses a term, social death, to describe what occurs when you go into slavery. What happens is that you've lost those connections to your society that provide the status that situates you in a healthy place. So, for example, the situation we see with Lot when Sodom loses in battle and he's taken along with other people from his household and even the city itself into captivity, he's experiencing a social death. And what happens, of course, is you have Abram as the kinsman redeemer who comes and delivers him from slavery and death. That's social death. So when we think about even the garden, what occurs is a social death and then a literal death, because they're delivered into slavery immediately, slavery to Satan, slavery to sin. And of course, they're not physically dead right away. There is this.
Hold it. Something dies in the garden. Where did the animal skins come from?
Oh, sure.
We have the first substitutionary sacrifice there.
Yeah, I'm with you. Yeah, I'm thinking, I understand it, but I was getting at their own personal deaths, which do eventually happen. So it's interesting to kind of play this out. So so if we think about social death as being something related to death, literally, even stories like Cinderella or something like that can be thought in these terms. That Cinderella experiences a kind of social death because she, is her connection to her true mother, her connection to her father, those are lost, and she's like reduced to bondage in the household that she finds herself in.
Be careful. There's going to be a new telling of Cinderella where the stepsisters are going to be misunderstood. I'm not kidding.
No, I know what you're saying. But
they're actually good, and they're just misunderstood. They're really nice people.
Yeah, and Cinderella was full of herself all along, and just because she was so much better looking than them, that she thought she was better. And
probably where it goes.
Yeah,
right.
Her privileges.
Her privilege, right.
But what's interesting? I don't see a lot of people reflect on it well, and especially because it's a somewhat taboo area. But when you get into, let's just talk about Genesis and the first stages to set the table for the concepts and realities that provide the core meanings for human reality in life. I mean, you're talking everything set up there in Genesis, everything from the ordering of time and the ways in which days function and nights function. You're set up with a semiotic system of reference that plays out throughout the whole of Scripture, but echoes everywhere in creation. Because yet Genesis becomes a kind of the true myth, if you will, that unlocks most. I mean, the fuller picture and truth, and sets forth the kind of core types that are going to be used, and these are going to be used as analogies that find their fulfillment in the eternal archetypes. I mean, human image of God, Christ, the eternal Logos, fulfilling that nature, right? Becoming to him. And there is a way in which I think Lewis's fuller and later understanding of myth true Christian myth is able to connect these things in just incredible ways, I think theologically and philosophically, and even in terms of the way the humanities function. But this stuff is there. It's not like Lewis is coming up with a kind of special theory. It's stuff there that requires attention, and a lot of people don't pay attention to those kinds of things.
Well, let's throw one more into the mix since we're in Genesis. Yeah. When on the fourth day, when the sun, moon, and stars are created, it says they're for times and seasons. Actually, the word season apparently means something like the appointed times, which is usually connected to the festivals. However, in the New Testament, we see at the appointed time, Jesus Christ came. Right. So you would expect the stars to have something to do with showing that, because that's their job, to show the appointed times. And lo and behold, we've got the Magi.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, the connections are just astounding when you really go down to these kinds of things.
Right.
So
I know you're the guy that's leading the way here on the show, Glenn. But maybe before we're done, we can revisit this thought of what can we see around us today that maybe has a mythic character that is in some sense kind of a realization or a reflection of this mythic sort of background in our own time. But anyway, I know you probably have other things you want to get to.
Well, I just want to throw in one more thing. I think that would be a really good thing to end on. But just one other quick note. In the dreams, the angel tells Joseph to take the child and his mother and go to Egypt.
Yeah.
And then take the child and his mother and come back.
Right.
Now, Joseph, all right, in the Roman Empire, the definition of a family is everyone who is under the authority of the paterfamilias, the
Right.
family father, which means that slaves are part of the family,
Sure.
whoever is there. Joseph is being addressed here as a paterfamilias. Take your family, which at this point consists of the child and his mother. But it's also distancing Joseph in a little bit from Jesus because he's not the biological father.
Right.
So there's a little bit of distance there, which I think is kind of interesting. But it points again, I think, to Joseph, son of David, as the king, as the legitimate king, even though he's has no idea of this, but as really the heir to the kings of Israel. His responsibility, the primary responsibility of any king, is to secure the succession. And he is acting in the role of, king is also the protector and all of those kinds of things. He is acting in all of those roles, which are themselves an outgrowth of the idea of the father, what the father does. The king functions as a father in society. Joseph is functioning as a king and a father both in taking care of the child and his mother. I mean, there's some really interesting things we could tease out there, but I think I will leave it at that. And let's I think we're in a situation looking at what are the mythic dimensions in our own lives today. I think we're in a situation where we've got some real handicaps here. Not the least of which is we're overwhelmingly left brain and have been taught not to think this way. So it becomes really hard for us, I think, to recognize this.
We've been shaped by bad myths. Scientism is one of them. Egalitarianism is another. I mean, there's a whole host that have bracketed out portions of reality and then redescribed them in such a way that we're even formed in a way we have no antenna for them. So there is definitely we participate in a series of what I would call modern or modernist myths, as much as we want to get out of them, that make us think, this is like our buffer, make us think that's what's real. And then we're still really talking about some kind of, experiential thing we can enter into in these fuller stories. And I think that right there is something Christianity is blowing a hole right back into. Is that's just a bad myth, and it's a bad story, and it is so because it has bracketed out the kinds of things that make sense of a fuller picture that Christianity has. But that's a very different question than where do we see echoes now of the gospel core types resonating even in this situation of bad myth.
Yeah, I guess my mind goes to the 4th chapter of Genesis and the 11th chapter, where we have elements that we can find, in those stories I'm talking about, obviously Cain and Abel, and then Cain's life after his killing Abel, and his children, Tubal Cain, and so forth. Envy, the kind of thing that we see between, say, Cain and Abel, and how that is, seemingly similar to what goes on with Romulus and Remus. So something like Augustine picks up on. Yeah. But then the Babel Project.
Babel, definitely.
Yeah, the Babel Project. We're in the middle of a recapitulation of the Babel Project. Yeah. I think about Apple computers. It's not a coincidence that Steve Jobs named it Apple, and it's not a coincidence that you have a bite taken out of the apple in the logo. He was very self-consciously embracing the lie of the serpent. He thinks that that's the true good news. Yeah. I actually think that that's something. It's that Peter Thiel believes something similar, and I think many of the many of the Silicon Valley gurus think that way. When I read interviews with them, when I listen in on their speculation, the interesting thing about those guys is that the higher up you go in that world, the less you encounter self-censorship. They really tell you what they're thinking, and what they tell you is blasphemous. I mean, outright blasphemy. Because they really do think it in these ways that we see on display, in Eden and in Babylon or at Babel. So that's now how that relates
to. I can jump in for a moment, Chris.
Sure.
It's worth noting that if you look at Cain's descendants, they're the guys who invent all the technology.
Oh yeah, that's right.
And we look at this. We look at this as Westerners and say, well, they weren't all bad. Look at all the good things they did.
Right.
Yeah. Read Paul Kingsnorth.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Or Ellul. Jacques Ellul reflects on all of that. Yeah, the meaning of the city in particular.
Yeah.
So now, of course, this ties into the work of the gospel. I think that Pentecost is a reverse of the curse that we see at Babel. And then how are we to understand? So this is obviously something I'm thinking a lot about lately because of the stuff I'm writing. But how do we understand the work of redeeming not just culture in the abstract, but the actual physical technologies that we've made? Are some of them the ring that just simply have to be destroyed? Or are there others, if we have the virtue of Aragorn, we can command them and direct them in good ways? Those are the things I've been thinking a lot about lately. And it seems to me that there's just a lot of, you go to, the story of Prometheus, you just go all over the place in terms of mythology. You see these things, same sorts of things being addressed.
Yeah. The thing about Aragorn and the Palantir, there are two things that are involved. Did he have the right and did he have the will? And
That's
both
right.
of them were necessary.
That's right.
Which is kind of an interesting thing because we don't think of the right very often.
Yeah.
We think anybody could have taken a Palantir and worked with it. I don't know. That's not quite how Tolkien suggests.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So,
well, anyway, we should probably wrap it up. Anything you want to say in conclusion here, Glenn?
Well, just that we've gone in a lot of different directions, and some of this has been a little bit on the speculative side and all that kind of thing. But I, at the least, hope that this might open up some new dimensions for the ways people think about a very, very familiar set of stories.
Yeah, well, that's great stuff. And this will be coming out before Christmas, I believe. So Merry Christmas to folks in Pugcast land. I hope you have a great Christmas celebration with family and in your church. And also, if you're looking to give a gift, you can always give a gift to the Pugcast. We are grateful receivers. Sometimes when people ask me, what is my gift? I say, I've got the gift of receiving. I receive really well.
For all of those people that you don't know what to get for them, you can give a donation in their name.
That's right. That's right. You can get a membership on Patreon in their name and give that to them as a gift. Wouldn't that be a wonderful gift to get? It'd be wonderful for us to receive your gifts. Anyway, there's a link in the show notes for that.
Yeah. And again, this isn't for our pockets. This is to pay the expenses of the show.
Yeah, we haven't taken anything. It's all gone to pay the bills. Anyway, thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Merry Christmas.
Yeah, Merry Christmas. Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Westminster Presbyterian Church in Battleground, Washington. The Theology Pugcast is produced and edited by Wiley Craft Productions of Nashville, Tennessee.